Hey folks, I know I am just an old guy telling stories, but please leave a like and subscribe before we start. Let's enjoy in today's stories. Before I dive into today's stories, I want to say, disclaimer. The content presented in the video is purely for entertainment purposes only. The theories and stories discussed in this video are speculative and are not supported by any evidence or proof. Viewer discretion is advised. Before I get into what happened, I want to make something clear. I'm not one of those people who randomly dive into the dark web for kicks. I don't look up hitmen or mystery boxes or whatever else those YouTube horror channels talk about. Honestly, my life is pretty boring. I'm a 26-year-old IT guy who spends most of his time in front of a screen, juggling remote work, playing games, and doom scrolling on Twitter. But a few weeks ago, I stumbled across something online that I can't explain, something I wish I had never clicked on. It started like any other Tuesday night. I had just finished work and was scrolling Reddit. The usual stuff, memes, tech subreddits, and some random unresolved mysteries posts. Somewhere down the rabbit hole, I came across a thread titled, "What's the weirdest thing you found online?" Most of the replies were standard, creepy Wikipedia pages, cursed YouTube videos, that sort of thing. But one comment caught my eye. It simply read, "If you really want to find something crazy, search for the playground on the dark web." I knew I shouldn't have clicked reply, but curiosity is a weird thing. I asked what it was, and within minutes the original commenter DM'd me. They sent a short message. "Use Tor, DuckDuckGo, search for the playground.onion. You'll see." Now, for those who don't know, the dark web isn't some magical hacker wonderland like Hollywood makes it out to be. You need specific software, like the Tor browser, to access .onion sites, and most of it is just junk, forums, outdated pages, and shady marketplaces. But this playground thing intrigued me. The name felt too innocent, like it was masking something more sinister. So, I did it. I downloaded Tor, fired it up, and switched over to DuckDuckGo to keep things discreet. It didn't take long to find what they were talking about. There was a small, unassuming site called The Playground. No graphics, no flashy text, just a plain black background with a single phrase written in white at the top, "Play with us if you dare." Underneath was a box to input an email address. Against my better judgment, I used a throwaway Gmail account I'd made for free trials. Seconds after hitting submit, I got an email with a link. The subject line read, "Your first step to the arena." That's when I should have stopped. I should have closed the browser, deleted the email, and gone back to watching Netflix. But I didn't. I clicked. The link took me to a new .onion site. It was cleaner, like someone actually put effort into its design. The background was dark gray, and in the center of the screen was a red button labeled, "Join the game." Below it was a warning. "Participation is at your own risk. No refunds, no complaints, no second chances." I laughed at the no refunds part. It felt weirdly corporate for something this shady. I hesitated for a moment, but eventually clicked the button. A new page loaded, and a small map appeared on the screen. It was zoomed in on an area I didn't recognize, with coordinates displayed in bold: 47.4925 degrees north, 19.0513 degrees east. Underneath the coordinates was a single word: "Go." The thing is, I'm not great with geography, so I copied the coordinates into Google Maps. It zoomed in on Budapest, Hungary, specifically an area near the outskirts of the city. I sat back in my chair, confused. Why Budapest? I don't live anywhere near there. I'm in Ohio. There was no way I was flying across the world for something I didn't even understand. I closed the site and figured that would be the end of it. But then things got weird. The next day, I started getting notifications on my phone. At first, they seemed random: emails, texts, even push notifications from apps I hadn't used in months. But they all had one thing in common: the same coordinates. A promotional email from Domino's Pizza with the coordinates written in the subject line. A Facebook Messenger notification that said, Check this out, with the location embedded. Even my fitness app sent me a push notification about steps taken toward your destination, listing the same numbers. I thought it was some kind of elaborate prank. Maybe someone hacked into my accounts, but no one else had access to my passwords, and I hadn't clicked on anything sketchy. Besides that dark web link, I tried ignoring it, but the messages didn't stop. By the end of the week, I had over 100. And they weren't just from apps. Friends and coworkers started texting me the coordinates too, even though they had no idea what they meant. It was like the universe was trying to shove me toward Budapest. 2 days later, I caved. I booked a cheap flight, telling myself it was just a mini vacation. Maybe I'd go, see nothing, and finally have some closure. I didn't tell anyone where I was going, not even my roommate. Something about this felt too personal. When I landed in Budapest, I rented a car and punched the coordinates into my GPS. It led me down a series of winding roads, each one emptier than the last. Eventually, I found myself on a dirt path surrounded by trees. The sun was setting and the area was eerily quiet, the kind of silence that makes your ears ring. At the end of the path, there was a clearing, and in the middle of it stood a massive building. It looked abandoned. Cracked concrete walls, shattered windows, and graffiti everywhere. But the strangest part was the sign above the door. In bright red letters it read, "Welcome to the playground." I parked the car and sat there for a minute, staring at the building. I told myself I'd come this far, so I might as well check it out. When I stepped inside, the air was damp and cold. The place smelled like mildew and rust, and the only light came from the gaps in the boarded-up windows. The floor was covered in dirt and debris, and every step I took echoed through the empty halls. As I walked deeper into the building, I started to notice something odd. The walls weren't just covered in graffiti, they were covered in names. Thousands of them written in different sizes and styles. Some were carved into the concrete, while others looked like they'd been painted on decades ago. I spotted names I recognized, friends from high school, co-workers, even my mom. That's when I saw the door. It was massive, made of steel, with a rusted handle that looked like it hadn't been touched in years. But scrawled across it in red paint were the words, "Are you ready to play?" I hesitated for what felt like forever before finally pushing it open. Inside was a large, empty room. At first, I thought it was a storage space. The floor was bare, and the walls were lined with what looked like coffins. Dozens of them, maybe more. I didn't realize what I was looking at until I stepped closer. The coffins weren't just random. They were labeled. Each one had a name carved into the wood. The first one I saw made my stomach drop. It had the name of my best friend, Ethan. I walked further down the row, and the names just kept coming. People I knew. People I hadn't thought about in years. And at the end of the room, there was one coffin that stopped me in my tracks. It had my name on it. Not just my first name, my full name. I froze, trying to process what I was seeing. Was this a joke? A coincidence? Could someone else have the exact same name? The coffin looked brand new, its wood unstained by time. The lid wasn't nailed down like the others. It was slightly ajar. I reached out to lift the lid, and that's where I'll stop for now. I need to get this out there before I even think about what to do next. If anyone knows what the playground is, please tell me, because whatever this is, it's not a game. I didn't touch it right away, the coffin. The one with my name on it. I stood there in that massive empty room, just staring at it. My full name, first and last, was carved so neatly into the wood that it almost looked like it had been laser-etched. The handwriting was too perfect, too deliberate, and I knew right away this wasn't some mistake. Whoever, or whatever, had done this knew exactly who I was. The lid was slightly open, just enough for me to see the dark void inside. But I didn't look. I couldn't bring myself to lift it any further. My hands were clammy, my throat dry, and for a second, I felt this overwhelming need to leave, to turn around and walk out the way I came. But that's the thing. There was no going back. I had come all this way, crossed continents and followed a breadcrumb trail of cryptic messages, only to end up in some decaying warehouse filled with coffins. Coffins with the names of people I knew. Coffins with my name. I needed answers. I started walking along the rows of coffins, hoping to spot something. A clue. A person. Anything that could explain what was going on. The names on the coffins were eerily familiar, but what struck me the most was how specific they were. It wasn't just random acquaintances or distant co-workers. It was everyone who mattered in my life. People who had shaped me, for better or worse. Ethan, my best friend, who helped me through my parents' divorce. Mrs. Taylor, my high school math teacher who pushed me to graduate when I nearly failed senior year. Even Sarah, my first girlfriend. I hadn't spoken to Sarah in years. I didn't even know where she lived anymore, but seeing her name scratched into the wood felt wrong, like someone had taken memories from my mind and turned them into something physical, something I could touch. I noticed the smaller coffins next. They weren't baby-sized or anything, just smaller, compact, more like boxes than coffins, really. Those had names on them, too. The first one I recognized was Biscuit. Biscuit was my dog, my childhood dog. He'd been gone for over a decade, but the second I saw that name, I was back in my parents' backyard, throwing a tennis ball for him to chase. I ran my fingers over the name. It was carved into the wood, just as carefully as the others. But there was something different about this one. The edges of the box were worn, like it had been here longer than the others. Who would even do something like this? And how? That's when I spotted the white envelope. It was sitting on top of the coffin with my name on it. A plain envelope folded neatly in half, with the word open scrawled across the front in red ink. Against every ounce of better judgment I had, I reached for it. The paper felt cold in my hands, like it had been sitting in a freezer. I unfolded it carefully, expecting some kind of cryptic message or clue. Instead, it was a single sentence, typed. "You're closer than you think." Closer to what? I read the note a second time, then flipped the paper over, hoping for something, an explanation, an answer, anything. But it was blank on the back. I looked around the room again, wondering if I had missed something. The coffins, the graffiti-covered walls, the dim light filtering in through broken windows, it all felt like a giant puzzle, but none of the pieces fit together. And then I heard it, a sound. Not footsteps, not voices, just a low, mechanical hum. It started faint, like it was coming from deep underground, but it grew louder by the second. The hum turned into a vibration, and I felt it through the soles of my shoes. The coffins rattled ever so slightly, like they were responding to whatever was beneath us. I didn't stick around to find out what it was. I shoved the note into my pocket, turned, and sprinted back toward the entrance. My sneakers skidded on the dusty concrete floor as I ran, and for a moment, I swore I heard something else, a faint scraping sound, like metal dragging against stone. But I didn't stop to look back. I burst through the front door of the warehouse and into the clearing. The fresh air hit me like a wave, and for a second I felt normal again. But then I saw my car. The front driver's side door was wide open. I knew I had locked it before I went inside. I was sure of it. I sprinted toward the car, my eyes darting around the clearing, expecting someone, anyone, to jump out at me. But the place was still empty. When I reached the car, I checked the back seat. Nothing. No one. But on the dashboard was another envelope. This one was smaller, and it had no writing on the outside. My hands shook as I opened it, expecting another vague note. Inside was a single photograph. It was me. The picture showed me standing in the clearing, looking at the warehouse. I must have been staring at the sign when it was taken, because my back was turned to the camera. But here's the thing. I was alone. No one else was in the photo, just me. I looked around again, my heart pounding, but the clearing was still empty. There were no footprints in the dirt except for my own. No tire tracks leading in or out. It was just me, the car, and the warehouse, and yet someone had taken that picture. I didn't go back inside. I couldn't. I grabbed the photo, got in the car, and started driving. My hands gripped the steering wheel so tight they hurt, but I didn't care. I just needed to get as far away from that place as possible. As I drove, I realized I had no plan. I had no idea what I'd just seen, no way of explaining it to anyone, and no clue what to do next. All I knew was that this wasn't over. Whoever or whatever was behind this knew too much about me. The coffins, the names, the photo. It wasn't random. And that note, the one in my pocket, kept repeating in my head, "You're closer than you think." Closer to what? I didn't know, but I was about to find out. I drove aimlessly for over an hour, sticking to back roads and trying to put as much distance as possible between me and that warehouse. My hands were still shaking on the wheel, and every so often I'd glance down at the photo on the passenger seat. The picture of me standing outside the building wouldn't leave my head. How had someone taken it without me noticing? And more importantly, why? After what felt like forever, I pulled into the parking lot of a roadside cafe. It wasn't some cozy Starbucks or modern chain. It was one of those small old-fashioned diners you only find in the middle of nowhere. A hand-painted sign out front read, "Maggie's Place," in fading red letters. The lights were still on, and there were a few cars parked outside, so I figured I'd go inside, grab a coffee, and clear my head. The cafe was almost empty. A middle-aged waitress stood behind the counter, wiping down the surface with a damp cloth. She gave me a polite nod as I walked in, but her smile faltered for a split second, like she'd seen something off about me. I didn't blame her. I probably looked like a mess. I slid into a booth by the window and ordered a coffee. The waitress, her name tag said Linda, brought it over within a minute. As she set the cup down, she gave me another look, one of those hesitant, "Are you okay?" glances. "You from around here?" she asked casually. I shook my head. "Just passing through." She nodded, but I could tell she didn't believe me. I wasn't about to explain everything, though. Not the warehouse, not the coffins, not the photo. What was I supposed to say? "Oh hey, I just came from a building full of creepy coffins with my name on one of them. Could you refill my coffee?" No way. Instead, I thanked her and stared out the window, trying to piece everything together. The dark web link, the coordinates, the names, the note, none of it made sense. And the hum I'd heard back in the warehouse, it was still in my ears, like a low, distant vibration that wouldn't go away. I pulled out the photo and set it on the table. Something about it kept bothering me, but I couldn't figure out what. It wasn't just that someone had taken it. It was when they'd taken it. I had been alone in that clearing. I was sure of it. So who or what had taken the picture? I was so lost in thought that I didn't notice the waitress walking back over until she was standing right next to me. Her eyes flicked down to the photo, and I swear, for a split second, her face changed. "Is that you?" she asked, her voice a little quieter than before. "Yeah," I said, sliding the photo back into my pocket. I didn't like the way she was looking at me, like she knew something she wasn't saying. She hesitated for a moment, then said, "We don't get many visitors this time of year." It was such a random thing to say, but the way she said it, like she was testing me, put me on edge. I nodded politely, mumbled something about being on a road trip, and she walked back to the counter. I paid for the coffee and left the cafe. As I walked back to the car, I had the distinct feeling that someone was watching me from inside. When I glanced back at the window, Linda was standing there, staring at me through the glass. I didn't stick around. I got back on the road and drove until I found a motel. It was one of those generic budget places with faded curtains and a flickering neon sign that read, "Vacancy." I wasn't planning on staying long, I just needed a place to crash for the night and figure out my next move. The room was basic: a bed, a desk, and a TV mounted on the wall. I set the photo down on the desk and pulled out my laptop. I didn't have much of a plan, but I figured I'd start by looking up the coordinates again. Maybe I'd missed something the first time. As I searched, I noticed something strange. Every time I tried to type the coordinates into Google Maps, the screen would glitch. The map would load for a second, then freeze, the coordinates disappearing before I could zoom in. I tried different search engines, DuckDuckGo, Bing, even some obscure mapping sites, but the same thing happened every time. It was like someone didn't want me to find that location again. Frustrated, I closed my laptop and leaned back in the chair. That's when I noticed the mirror. It was hanging on the wall next to the bed, one of those cheap, rectangular mirrors you find in motels. But something about it seemed off. I got up and walked over to it, half expecting to find a camera or some kind of hidden recording device. I ran my fingers along the edges, tapped the glass, even checked behind it. Nothing. But when I stepped back, I saw something in the reflection that made me freeze. The bed. The bed was perfectly normal in the room itself, just a standard boring mattress with a floral patterned comforter. But in the mirror, the bed looked wrong. The comforter was torn in several places. The sheets were dark and stained, and the pillows were missing. I turned back to the bed itself. It was fine, clean even. But in the mirror, it was completely different. And that wasn't all. There was something else in the reflection. Someone was sitting on the bed. I spun around, my heart pounding, but the room was empty. No one was there. I turned back to the mirror. The figure was still there, sitting on the edge of the bed. They were hunched over, their face obscured by shadows, but I could make out the outline of their body. They weren't moving, just sitting there, completely still. I blinked, and the figure was gone. The reflection was normal again. The bed looked fine, and the room was empty. I didn't sleep that night. The next morning, I checked out of the motel as soon as the sun came up. I didn't care about the reflection, the photo, or the strange glitching coordinates. I just wanted to get away. But as I walked out to the car, I noticed something on the windshield. It was another envelope. No note this time, just a key. A small, rusted key with a red tag attached to it. The tag had 2 words written on it in the same red ink as before. "You're ready." Ready for what? I didn't know, but I had a feeling I was about to find out. The rusted key sat in the palm of my hand as I leaned against my car, staring at it like it might jump out of my fingers. The red tag with those 2 words, "You're ready," was what made my stomach churn. I wasn't ready for anything, but whoever was pulling these strings thought otherwise. I thought about leaving the key behind, just tossing it into a ditch and driving home, but I knew it wouldn't matter. Whatever this was, whoever was behind it, they wouldn't stop. I didn't have a choice. I typed the warehouse coordinates into my car's GPS again. This time, they loaded perfectly, like there had never been a problem. No glitches, no error messages, just a straight route back to where it all began. The drive felt longer this time. The road seemed emptier, the trees along the dirt path darker, like they'd been painted over since I was last here. I had this strange sense that the world outside the car wasn't quite real, like I was driving through a memory instead of an actual place. When I finally reached the clearing, the warehouse loomed ahead, unchanged. The red "Welcome to the Playground" sign still hung over the entrance, its letters peeling slightly in the daylight, but something was different. The front door, the heavy steel one I'd pushed open the last time, was already ajar. I parked the car and grabbed the key. My footsteps crunched on the dirt as I approached the warehouse, and the closer I got, the more I realized the silence was almost too perfect. No birds, no wind, no ambient noise, just my own movements and the faint creak of the steel door swaying slightly in the breeze. When I stepped inside, I immediately noticed that the coffins were gone. The massive, empty room where they had once been was completely bare now. The walls were still covered in graffiti and names, but the rows of wooden boxes were missing. It was as if they'd never been there at all. The only thing left in the room was a single metal door on the far wall that I hadn't noticed before. It was different from the one I'd come through, smaller, more industrial looking, with a thick lock dangling from the handle. That's when I realized the rusted key in my pocket was for that door. I stood there for what felt like forever, staring at the door, debating whether or not to open it. A part of me hoped it would lead to an empty room, or maybe just a supply closet, but I knew better by now. This wasn't random. It was deliberate. I slid the key into the lock and turned it. The mechanism groaned as it unlocked, and the door swung open with a low, metallic creak. Behind it was a staircase leading down. The air that wafted up from the stairwell was cold and damp, with a faint metallic tang that reminded me of the smell of old pennies. I hesitated at the top step, gripping the handrail tightly, before finally descending into the darkness. The stairs spiraled down for what felt like forever. There were no lights, just the faint glow of daylight spilling in from the open door above. My phone's flashlight barely lit the steps ahead, but eventually, I reached the bottom. The stairwell opened into another room, this one much smaller than the one above. The walls were smooth and gray, and the floor was covered in a thick layer of dust. In the center of the room stood a table. It was a simple wooden table. Nothing fancy, but on top of it was something I didn't expect. A laptop. The laptop was old, with a scuffed plastic shell and a faintly buzzing screen. Next to it was a pair of headphones and another envelope. The envelope was smaller than the ones I'd seen before, and when I opened it, I found a single slip of paper inside. It had one sentence typed on it. "Watch and listen." I sat down at the table and hesitated before putting the headphones on. They were warm, like someone else had been wearing them recently. The laptop screen flickered for a moment before a video began to play. The video showed the clearing outside the warehouse. It was filmed from above, like a drone or security camera had captured the footage. At first, the clearing was empty, just a wide patch of dirt surrounded by trees. But then, one by one, people began to appear. The first person to walk into the clearing was Ethan, my best friend. He looked confused, glancing around like he wasn't sure where he was or why he was there. Next came Mrs. Taylor, my high school math teacher. Then Sarah, my first girlfriend. More and more people filed into the clearing, and I recognized every single one of them. Friends, co-workers, family members, even people I hadn't spoken to in years. They all looked confused, some of them frightened, as they stood in the clearing, waiting for something. I reached for the volume dial on the headphones, turning it up to hear what was happening. At first, there was nothing but the faint hum I'd heard in the warehouse before. But then, a voice, a distorted, mechanical voice, spoke through the headphones. "The game begins now." The screen went black. For a few seconds, I just sat there, staring at the dark screen. My mind raced with questions, but the only thing I could focus on was the phrase, "The game begins now." What game? Was this some kind of sick prank? And why were all those people there? People I knew, people I hadn't seen in years. I pulled off the headphones and stood up, backing away from the table. That's when I noticed something I hadn't seen before. A small door on the far side of the room. It was painted the same color as the walls, almost camouflaged, but it had the same kind of lock as the door upstairs. I still had the key in my pocket, so I crossed the room and tried it on the new door. It fit perfectly. Beyond the door was a narrow hallway, lined with what looked like security monitors. Each screen displayed a different angle of the clearing outside the warehouse. But now the clearing wasn't empty. It was full of people. The same people I'd seen in the video. Ethan, Mrs. Taylor, Sarah, and all the others were standing there looking more confused and panicked by the second. On one of the screens, I saw something that made my stomach drop. I saw myself, not in the warehouse, not in the hallway. I was standing in the clearing with them, wearing the same clothes I had on right now, looking just as confused as everyone else. But I wasn't there. I was in the hallway, watching it all happen on a screen. I stepped back, my breath catching in my throat. The monitors began to flicker, the distorted hum growing louder until all the screens went black. And then, the same distorted voice spoke again, this time from somewhere in the hallway itself. "Welcome to the game, Player One." The distorted voice echoed down the hallway, sharp and mechanical, as if it were coming from hidden speakers embedded in the walls. "Welcome to the game, Player One." For a moment I couldn't move. My mind was stuck on the image I had just seen on the monitors, me standing in the clearing surrounded by people I knew. But I wasn't there. I was in the hallway. It didn't make any sense. I took a step back toward the door I'd just come through, but it had silently shut behind me. There was no handle, no lock, just a smooth, solid surface. I wasn't getting out that way. The hallway stretched ahead, dimly lit by faint fluorescent lights. The hum that had followed me since the warehouse was louder now, vibrating faintly through the floor. As I moved forward, I noticed writing on the walls. The same red ink that had marked the envelopes was now smeared across the smooth concrete, forming words and sentences that didn't seem to connect to each other. "You've always been watched. The game was never fair. There's no escape." I kept walking, my heart pounding with every step. The hallway twisted and turned, splitting off into smaller passageways that seemed to lead nowhere. Each turn felt like a loop, like I was walking in circles. And then I saw the door. It was different from the others. Bright white, with no markings, no handles, just a small keypad next to it. I approached the keypad cautiously, half expecting it to start buzzing or flashing. But the screen remained blank, waiting. I glanced around the hallway, hoping for some kind of clue. And that's when I noticed the envelope. It was taped to the wall next to the door, the same plain white as the others. My name was written on the front. With shaking hands, I pulled it free and opened it. Inside was a single slip of paper with a 4-digit code, 1989. I stared at the numbers for a long time. That was the year I was born. Was it a coincidence? Or had whoever created this game somehow known everything about me from the start? I punched the code into the keypad. The door clicked open, revealing a room that was almost blindingly white, like every surface had been scrubbed clean. Inside, there was only one thing: a chair. The chair was metal, bolted to the floor in the center of the room. It looked like something out of a dentist's office, complete with straps on the armrests and legs. Above it hung a single monitor, suspended from the ceiling by a thin metal arm. The screen flickered to life as I stepped inside. It showed the clearing again, but this time it was empty. The people I'd seen before, Ethan, Mrs. Taylor, Sarah, they were gone. The clearing looked completely abandoned, with no sign that anyone had been there. As I stared at the screen, the same distorted voice returned, quieter this time, almost calm. "The choices you've made have led you here." "What choices?" I said out loud, my voice cracking. "I didn't choose any of this." The monitor flickered, and the clearing on the screen began to change. Slowly, the camera panned toward a coffin sitting in the middle of the dirt. It was the coffin with my name on it. I took a step back, my pulse racing, but the voice continued. "This is your final task. Sit in the chair to proceed." "No," I said firmly, shaking my head. "I'm not doing this. Player One must proceed." The door behind me slammed shut, locking with a sharp click. The room felt smaller now, the walls pressing in, the light growing harsher. The voice spoke again, louder this time. "Sit in the chair." I didn't know what would happen if I refused, but part of me didn't want to find out. Reluctantly, I approached the chair. The metal was cold against my skin as I sat down, and the straps automatically clicked into place, binding my wrists and ankles. The monitor above me flickered again. This time it showed me, not the version of me in the clearing, but the real me, sitting in the chair, staring up at the screen. It was like I was watching myself from someone else's perspective. The voice spoke one final time. "The game is complete. Player 1, your prize is knowledge." "Knowledge of what?" I shouted. The screen flickered again, and a series of images flashed across it. Memories. My memories. They moved too fast for me to fully process, but I recognized them all. Moments from my childhood, my teenage years, my time in college, even random mundane days I had completely forgotten about. But then the images shifted. They weren't just my memories anymore. They were scenes I couldn't explain, people I'd never met, places I'd never been. A man sitting in an empty subway car, a woman standing on the edge of a cliff, a child staring at a blank TV screen. None of it made sense, but somehow I felt connected to all of it. Like these weren't just random moments, they were pieces of something bigger. The monitor went dark, and the room was silent again. The straps around my wrists and ankles released automatically. I stood up, my legs shaky, and the door behind me unlocked with a soft click. When I stepped out of the room, I was back in the clearing. The warehouse was gone. The dirt beneath my feet was undisturbed, like no one had ever been there. My car was parked exactly where I'd left it. I climbed into the driver's seat and sat there for a long time, staring at the empty field. I kept expecting something to happen. Another envelope, another message, but nothing did. Eventually, I started the car and drove away. It's been 2 weeks since that day, and I still don't know what to make of it. The photo I found on the dashboard is gone. The emails, the notifications, they've all disappeared, like they never existed. Even the dark web link to the playground is gone. I've searched for answers, but nothing comes up. It's like the entire thing was erased, leaving no trace except for my memories. But every now and then I catch myself looking over my shoulder or checking the corners of my room, half expecting to see something, or someone, watching me. Because here's the thing. I never found out what the game was actually about. And a part of me wonders if it's still happening. Alright, so before I get into this, let me just say I know how dumb this whole thing sounds. If I was reading this instead of writing it, I'd probably roll my eyes and call me an idiot. But I swear, everything I'm about to tell you actually happened. And no, I wasn't drunk or high or whatever. I was stone cold sober. Honestly, I kind of wish I wasn't, because then I'd have a better excuse for why I even went through with this. Anyway, here goes. A couple of months ago, I got into this weird rabbit hole on YouTube about the dark web. You know, the typical top 10 creepy things found on the dark web videos. They always end with some guy claiming he found a cursed VHS tape or something. But for some reason I couldn't stop watching them. It was late, like 1 a.m., and instead of going to bed like a normal person, I started Googling how to actually access the dark web. I'd heard of Tor before, basically a browser that lets you access those .onion sites, but I'd never bothered to try it. I downloaded Tor, set it up, and started poking around. To be clear, I wasn't looking to buy anything sketchy like drugs or fake passports. I was just curious. Most of the stuff I came across was boring, honestly. Forums with edgy usernames arguing about conspiracy theories, marketplaces selling overpriced junk, even a website claiming to sell haunted dolls. Typical internet garbage, just with a darker aesthetic. But then I found this link. It was buried in some random forum thread with terrible grammar, and it didn't even have a name, just a string of numbers and letters followed by .onion. The post said something like, "Only for the brave, must have good internet connection." It had a bunch of replies like fake and "don't waste your time," but one reply stood out. It just said, "This is real. Don't do it." No context, no follow-up. And of course, being the genius I am, I clicked it. The site was plain. just a black screen with a single line of text in the middle. Where would you like to go? Underneath, there was a text box where you could type something in. At first, I thought it was a broken website, like one of those fake ARG things people make for fun. But as I stared at the screen, I had this weird thought. What if I typed in my actual location? Not my exact address, I wasn't that stupid, but the name of the town I lived in, just to see what would happen. I typed it in and hit enter. Nothing happened for a few seconds. Then, the screen refreshed, and a new line of text appeared. Route prepared. Download directions. It gave me two options, yes or no. Now, I know what you're thinking. Why the hell would anyone click yes in this situation? Trust me, I asked myself the same thing. But something about the whole thing felt different. Like, I wasn't sure if it was a joke or not. And if it was a joke, I wanted to see the punchline. So yeah, I clicked yes. A PDF started downloading onto my computer. I opened it, and it was literally a set of step-by-step directions. Not to my house, thankfully, but to some random spot in the middle of nowhere, like way out in the boonies. I copied the coordinates into Google Maps, and it looked like it was about 2 hours away from me, in some rural area I'd never been to before. There was no name for the location, just a blank spot on the map with nothing but trees and dirt roads around it. At this point, I should have stopped. I know I should have stopped. But part of me thought this was some kind of elaborate prank or viral marketing thing. I mean, who even sets up a random website like that just to give someone fake directions? Plus, the PDF looked so specific, like someone had actually scouted the route and written it down. It even mentioned landmarks like turn left at the rusted mailbox and follow the dirt road past the dead oak tree. I convinced myself it wasn't real, or if it was real, it was just going to lead me to some abandoned house or a clearing in the woods. Creepy, sure, but not dangerous. Probably. Besides, I had nothing better to do that weekend, so I thought, why not? The next morning, I packed a bag with some essentials: water, snacks, a flashlight, and a portable phone charger, just in case. I wasn't planning to stay long, but I figured it was better to be over-prepared than under-prepared. I didn't tell anyone where I was going, though, because how do you even explain something like this without sounding like a lunatic? Hey, Mom, I found some directions on the dark web, and I'm going to follow them to see where they lead. Don't worry, it's probably not a trap. Yeah, no. I left around 10 a.m., and the drive started out normal enough. Highway for a while, then a turnoff onto smaller roads that got progressively less paved the further I went. By the time I hit the dirt road mentioned in the PDF, I hadn't seen another car in at least 20 minutes. There were no houses, no gas stations, not even a barn, just trees and silence. Eventually, I came to the dead oak tree from the directions. It was huge, twisted and blackened, like it had been struck by lightning years ago. I turned onto the path next to it, which was barely wide enough for my car, and followed it until I hit a clearing. The PDF had said to park there and walk the rest of the way. My phone had no signal, but the GPS was still working, so I pulled up the coordinates and checked my location. I was close, maybe a 10-minute walk according to the map. I grabbed my bag, locked the car, and started walking. The forest around me was dense, and the path was overgrown with weeds and fallen branches. It didn't look like anyone had been out there in years. At one point, I thought about turning back, but I kept telling myself I'd come this far, so I might as well see it through. Stupid, I know, but hindsight's 20/20. After about 10 minutes, I reached the coordinates. There was nothing, just a patch of flat ground covered in moss and dirt. For a second, I thought I'd been pranked after all. But then I noticed something weird. The ground didn't feel right under my feet. It wasn't soft like dirt or firm like rock. It was hollow. I stomped lightly and the sound was off, like there was an empty space beneath me. I started brushing away the moss with my hands, and that's when I found it. A metal hatch, almost completely buried. It had no markings, no handle, just a smooth surface with a circular seam around the edge. At the center was a small glass panel about the size of a smartphone. I wiped the dirt off the panel, and the screen lit up with a faint green glow. There was no text or buttons, just this pulsing light, like it was scanning something. I had no idea what I was looking at, but one thing was clear. This was not some old storm shelter or forgotten fallout bunker. Whatever this was, it was way beyond anything I'd expected to find. And the weirdest part? I still hadn't seen a single person. No cars, no hikers, no footprints. It was just me, alone in the middle of nowhere, staring at a hatch that clearly didn't belong there. That's when I realized the directions weren't just random. Someone, or something, had wanted me to find this place. I stood there for what felt like ages, staring at this hatch in the ground. I wish I could say I had some kind of master plan, but honestly, I was just winging it. There were no instructions, no buttons, and that glass panel in the middle just kept glowing faintly. I thought maybe it was some kind of scanner, but I had no clue what it was scanning for. My hand? My face? A code I didn't have? I waved my hand over it, tapped it lightly, and even pressed my phone against it to see if it would react. Nothing. But as I crouched down to take a closer look, I noticed the seam around the hatch had a tiny gap, almost like a lid on a container. There was no handle, but when I pushed down lightly on the edge, the hatch moved ever so slightly. This wasn't some unopenable high-tech door. It was just heavy, really heavy. I put my weight into it and slowly managed to lift it enough to wedge my flashlight underneath as a makeshift lever. Once I had some momentum, the hatch swung open with a metallic groan that echoed through the trees. What I saw underneath made me pause. The opening led straight down into darkness, but there was a ladder bolted to the side. The metal rungs were rusted, but they looked sturdy enough. I leaned over to shine my flashlight down the hole and saw that it went deeper than I'd expected. Maybe 20 feet. The bottom wasn't just dirt, though. It was concrete, and it looked clean, like it had been maintained. I stood up and looked around. The forest was silent except for the faint rustle of leaves in the breeze. Still no signs of life. No cars, no hikers. No one yelling at me to get off their property. The thought crossed my mind that this could be private land and I was trespassing, but there were no signs, no fences, no warnings. And, well, I'd come this far. I started climbing down the ladder, one rung at a time, testing each step before putting my weight on it. The air got noticeably cooler the further down I went, and by the time my feet hit the concrete floor, it felt like I was standing in a refrigerator. The first thing I noticed was the smell. It wasn't bad exactly, just sterile, like the faint scent of rubbing alcohol mixed with metal and damp stone. It was oddly specific, like being in a hospital basement. My flashlight beam swept across the walls, which were smooth and featureless, except for a faint grid pattern etched into the concrete. I turned around and saw a corridor stretching out in front of me. It wasn't very wide, maybe 6 feet across, and the ceiling was just high enough that I didn't have to duck. The walls were lined with dim, recessed lights, some of which flickered slightly. They gave off this cold, bluish-white glow that only added to the unsettling vibe. What was weird, though, was how quiet it was. I've been in basements and underground parking garages before, and there's always some kind of background noise, dripping water, creaking pipes, maybe the hum of distant machinery. But here, nothing. Just the soft hum of those flickering lights and my own footsteps echoing down the corridor. The PDF directions didn't mention anything beyond the coordinates, so I had no idea where I was supposed to go or what I was supposed to find. I kept walking, shining my flashlight at every corner and junction, trying to get a sense of the layout. The place wasn't a maze exactly, but it was big. The corridors branched off into smaller rooms, some of which had metal doors that were slightly ajar. One room I peeked into had rows of shelves filled with dusty plastic containers. Most of them were labeled with long strings of letters and numbers that didn't make any sense to me. Another room looked like some kind of lab, with counters, sinks, and even a microscope sitting in the corner. But there was no dust in there, no signs of age, just a faint layer of condensation on the metal surfaces, like it had been wiped clean recently. I started to wonder how long this place had been here. Decades? Longer? And why wasn't it locked up? It didn't look abandoned, but it didn't feel active either. It was like someone had just left it, half prepared, like they might come back at any moment. The further I went, the stranger the place became. Some of the rooms had equipment I couldn't even begin to identify. Large glass cylinders connected by thick cables, strange machines with blinking lights and switches, even what looked like a giant steel chair bolted to the floor. There were no logos, no labels, no branding of any kind. But it wasn't until I reached the end of the main corridor that I found the room. The one that made everything else I'd seen so far look almost normal by comparison. The door was different from the others, larger, heavier, and sealed shut with a circular locking mechanism. It looked like something you'd see on a submarine, but there was no keypad or handle. Just a small panel next to the door, identical to the one on the hatch outside. I reached out to touch it, and the panel lit up with that same faint green glow. This time, though, it actually responded. A line of text appeared on the screen. Biometric scan required. Biometric? I had no idea what that meant. Was it asking for a fingerprint? My retina? I tried pressing my thumb against the glass, but nothing happened. Then I tried holding my hand over it, like before, and the light flickered briefly before turning red. Access denied. I was about to give up when the screen changed again. Override in progress. Override. I didn't do anything. The screen started flashing, and the locking mechanism on the door clicked loudly. A second later, the door hissed and swung open, revealing a dark room beyond. Inside, the air felt even colder than before. My flashlight beam swept across the floor, which was smooth and reflective, almost like glass. The walls were lined with massive machines humming quietly, their surfaces glowing faintly with soft, pulsing lights. But in the center of the room was the thing that made me stop dead in my tracks. A large, cylindrical pod stood upright, encased in what looked like a thick glass shell. Frost coated the outside, making it hard to see inside, but there was something moving. Barely, but definitely moving. I stepped closer and wiped a patch of frost away with my sleeve. What I saw inside didn't make sense. It wasn't human. It was tall, taller than me, with pale bluish skin and elongated limbs. Its head was larger than its body should have allowed, with dark oval-shaped eyes that were closed, like it was asleep. Tubes and wires connected to its chest, and a faint vapor swirled around its body, as if it was submerged in some kind of cold mist. I didn't know what I was looking at. Then, as I reached out to touch the glass, the pod's lights changed from white to a deep pulsing blue, and the surface began to vibrate softly. Something was waking up. I froze. The lights on the pod had gone from that cold white to a pulsing blue, and the vibration wasn't just faint anymore. It was steady, like a low hum you could feel in the floor. I stepped back instinctively, but my eyes stayed locked on the figure inside the pod. Its chest, which had looked perfectly still just a second ago, was now rising and falling ever so slightly. It was alive. My brain was struggling to make sense of what I was seeing. This wasn't a person in some science fiction movie costume. It wasn't one of those hyper-realistic mannequins you see in museums or stores. No, this thing looked real. The way its skin caught the dim light, the almost imperceptible twitch in its fingers, the way condensation formed on the inside of the pod's glass like it was breathing. It all felt too detailed to be fake. I should have left. Right then and there, I should have just bolted back up the ladder, gotten in my car, and driven straight home. But instead I stood there like an idiot, staring at this thing as if watching it long enough would make it less impossible. The room was cold, and the faint frost on the glass of the pod started to melt as the lights inside grew brighter. I wiped my sleeve across my forehead, Apparently, stress makes you sweat even when it's freezing, and stepped closer to the pod again. There was something written on the base of the cylinder, etched into the metal, but it wasn't in any language I recognized. The characters were strange, angular, almost geometric, like something you'd see on the cover of a conspiracy theory book about ancient civilizations. I reached out, slowly this time, and touched the surface of the pod. The vibration beneath my fingertips was stronger than I'd expected, and the glass felt warm now, like whatever was inside was heating up. As soon as my hand made contact, the lights on the pod shifted again, from blue to a soft yellow, and a faint hiss escaped from somewhere near the base. I stumbled back, heart pounding, as a thin stream of vapor began leaking out of the sides. It wasn't smoke, more like a fine mist that dissipated almost instantly. The hum of the machines around me grew louder, and for the first time, I noticed a faint pattern of light moving across the floor, like the circuits built into the room were coming to life. This wasn't just some random underground bunker. This place was built for a purpose, and whatever that purpose was, it involved this. The pod's glass started to slide open, splitting horizontally down the middle. The sound was surprisingly smooth, like the machinery was still in perfect working order, even after however many years it had been down here. The mist thickened briefly as the two halves of the glass pulled apart, revealing the figure inside more clearly. It didn't wake up right away. For a moment it just stayed there, suspended in the mist, its eyes still closed, its chest rising and falling in a steady rhythm. The wires and tubes attached to its body released one by one, retracting back into the base of the pod with soft clicks. I didn't move. I didn't even breathe. And then, its eyes opened. They were black. Completely black, without pupils or whites or anything else remotely human about them. But they weren't lifeless. They darted around the room, scanning their surroundings with a sharp, almost mechanical precision. When they finally landed on me, I felt the kind of pressure you feel when someone is staring directly at you, like it was aware of me. I held up my hands, palms out, like I was trying to show it I wasn't a threat. Not that I thought it would understand the gesture, but what else was I supposed to do? Say hello? It didn't move right away. It just watched me, tilting its head slightly, like it was trying to figure out what I was. Its movements were deliberate, smooth, but not stiff, like it was perfectly in control of every muscle, every twitch, every motion. And then, to my complete disbelief, it stepped out of the pod. The thing stood at least 7 feet tall, maybe more. Up close, its skin wasn't just bluish. It had this faint, almost metallic sheen, like the surface of a coin catching the light. Its hands were long and thin, with fingers that seemed just a little too many joints to be normal. It didn't have clothes in the traditional sense, but there was some kind of material wrapped around its torso and legs, almost like a suit, but seamless, as if it was part of its body. It took one step toward me, and I backed up instinctively, nearly tripping over my own feet. I managed to catch myself on one of the machines, which made a loud clang that echoed through the room. The creature froze, its head snapping in my direction. I expected it to lunge at me, or make a noise or something, but it just stood there watching me. Its breathing was steady, its posture calm. It didn't seem hostile, but it didn't seem friendly either. It was neutral. I couldn't take my eyes off it. The sheer presence of it was overwhelming, like standing next to something that wasn't supposed to exist, but did anyway. After what felt like an eternity, it raised one of its hands and pointed at the far wall. At first I didn't understand what it was doing, but then I noticed a section of the wall that I hadn't paid attention to before. There was a panel there glowing faintly with the same blue light I'd seen earlier. The creature took a step back, still watching me, and pointed again, this time with more urgency. It wanted me to do something. Against every ounce of common sense, I walked to the panel and placed my hand on it. The screen lit up immediately, displaying more of those strange symbols. They shifted and rearranged themselves in patterns I couldn't decipher, but the creature seemed satisfied. It stepped closer, its movements smooth and purposeful, and pressed its own hand against the panel next to mine. The lights in the room dimmed briefly, and I heard the faint sound of machinery whirring to life somewhere in the distance. A second later, a section of the far wall slid open, revealing another corridor beyond. The creature stepped back, gestured toward the corridor, and then looked at me. It wanted me to follow. I don't know what possessed me to step through that doorway, but I did. It wasn't like I had much of a choice, though. The creature was standing just behind me, its gaze fixed on me like it was waiting to see what I'd do next. The corridor beyond the wall looked similar to the ones I'd seen before: smooth concrete walls, recessed lighting, and no signs of wear or age. But there was something different about it, something more deliberate. This space didn't feel abandoned like the rest of the bunker. As I walked, the creature followed close behind me. It didn't make a sound, which somehow made its presence feel even more overwhelming. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being led somewhere, though whether it was to learn something or something else, I wasn't sure. The corridor stretched further than I expected, bending slightly to the left every so often, and every now and then I'd glance over my shoulder. The creature wasn't walking beside me or rushing me. It just kept its distance, like it was making sure I didn't turn back. Not that I was planning to. At this point, I was in too deep, both literally and figuratively. After a few minutes, the corridor opened up into a large circular room. The first thing I noticed was how bright it was. The light wasn't coming from the ceiling or walls. It was emanating from the floor, which was made of the same reflective material as the pod's base. It was strange, though. The light wasn't harsh or blinding. It was soft, diffused, almost calming, though it did little to ease my nerves. In the center of the room was a platform, raised slightly above the floor. It was covered in the same glowing symbols I'd seen on the pod and the panel, arranged in patterns that seemed random but too precise to be meaningless. Surrounding the platform were several tall cylindrical machines, similar to the one the creature had been inside but slightly smaller. Most of them were empty, their glass shells fogged over, but one of them wasn't. Inside the cylinder closest to the platform was another figure. This one was smaller, about my height, and its skin was pale but not blue like the first creature's. In fact, it looked almost human. Almost. The proportions were close: 2 arms, 2 legs, a head, but the features were slightly off, like a sculpture that hadn't been fully refined. The eyes were closed, and it wasn't moving. I felt a chill creep up my back. Was this another of whatever the creature behind me was? Or was it something else? Before I could think too much about it, the creature walked past me and approached the platform. It placed its hand on a panel at the edge, and the symbols on the platform began to shift and glow more brightly. The hum of machinery filled the air, louder than before, but still not overpowering. Then the creature looked at me again, its dark eyes unreadable, and gestured for me to come closer. I hesitated. Whatever was happening here, it was way out of my depth. I wasn't a scientist or an engineer or anyone remotely qualified to deal with this. But the creature didn't seem threatening. If anything, it was patient, calm, deliberate, and oddly focused on me. I stepped onto the platform, and the glowing symbols reacted instantly. They shifted beneath my feet, forming new patterns that seemed to spiral outward from where I was standing. The light grew brighter, and for a moment I thought I might have triggered something I wasn't supposed to. The creature raised its hand, and the lights dimmed slightly. It walked to the cylinder with the human-like figure inside and pressed its hand against the glass. The symbols on the platform shifted again, and the machinery surrounding the room let out a faint, rhythmic pulse. I watched as the glass of the cylinder began to slide open, just like the pod had earlier. The mist that escaped this time was heavier, clinging to the air like dry ice. The figure inside didn't wake up right away. It remained still, suspended in whatever strange state it had been in. That's when I noticed the markings on its skin. They weren't tattoos exactly, but they were intricate. lines and symbols etched into its arms and chest, glowing faintly in the dim light. The patterns looked similar to the ones on the platform, and I couldn't tell if they were part of its body or something added later. Either way, it was clear that this thing, whatever it was important to the creature. I was so focused on the figure in the cylinder that I almost didn't notice the walls beginning to shift. Sections of the smooth concrete were retracting, revealing what looked like screens embedded into the structure. The screens flickered to life, displaying images and symbols that I couldn't make sense of. At first it was just static, lines of glowing text in that same strange language. But then the images started to appear. The first image showed the Earth. I recognized it immediately, but it wasn't a modern view from space. The continents were different, smaller, and broken apart in ways that didn't match any map I'd ever seen. It looked ancient, like a version of the planet that hadn't existed for millions of years. The next image was harder to process. It showed something leaving the Earth. A craft, maybe, or some kind of structure rising into space. The details were hard to make out, but the shape of it looked eerily similar to the pod the creature had been inside. The final image was the strangest. It showed a massive network of lights stretching across the galaxy like a web. At the center of the web was a bright, pulsing light, Earth, and the lines extended outward to other glowing points in the distance. I looked at the creature, but its focus was entirely on the screens. It raised its hand again and the images faded, replaced by a single line of text in the strange language. Then it turned to me, its expression, if you could call it that, as neutral as ever. And then, for the first time, it made a sound. It wasn't a word exactly, but more like a series of low tones, each one rising and falling in a rhythm that sounded almost intentional. It repeated the sound, then gestured toward the human-like figure in the cylinder it was trying to communicate. I didn't know what it wanted me to do. Wake the figure up? Activate something? It gestured to the platform beneath my feet, then to the panel on the side of the cylinder. The message was clear. I was supposed to do something. But the question was, what? I stood there, feeling the weight of whatever this moment was supposed to be. The creature was watching me closely, and the glowing platform beneath my feet hummed softly, like it was waiting. The figure inside the cylinder, the human-like one, was still motionless, but the patterns etched into its skin glowed faintly, pulsing in time with the lights on the walls. The creature repeated the sound it had made earlier, a series of tones that seemed too deliberate to be random. It gestured to the panel on the side of the cylinder, then back at me. Whatever was happening, it wanted me to do something. I stepped closer to the panel, careful not to trip over the glowing lines etched into the floor. The surface of the panel lit up as soon as my hand hovered near it, displaying more of those strange symbols. This time, though, they didn't feel meaningless. I couldn't read them exactly, but there was a rhythm to the way they moved, like they were reacting to me somehow. I glanced back at the creature, hoping for some kind of reassurance. It didn't move, but there was a stillness to it, a kind of quiet focus that made me think it was waiting for me to figure things out on my own. I placed my hand on the panel, and the symbols shifted again, arranging themselves into a spiral that spread outward from the center of the screen. A faint vibration ran through the floor, and the lights in the room dimmed slightly. The cylinder hissed softly as more of that mist leaked out, and for a moment, I thought I'd done something wrong. But then the figure inside began to move. Its head tilted slightly, and its hands twitched, the long, delicate fingers curling and uncurling as if testing their strength. Its eyes opened, narrow, almond-shaped, and glowing faintly with a soft golden light. It blinked once, slowly, and then turned its head toward me. I took a step back, instinctively raising my hands. The creature near the platform didn't react, but the figure in the cylinder smiled. It wasn't a human smile exactly. There was something about it that felt too smooth, too controlled, like it was imitating an expression rather than feeling it. But there was no hostility in it, just curiosity. The cylinder slid open completely, and the figure stepped out onto the platform. Up close, it looked even more human than I'd realized, but not quite enough to pass as one. The proportions were slightly off. Its limbs were just a little too long, its features a little too symmetrical. The glowing markings on its skin shifted and pulsed in patterns that seemed to respond to the lights on the platform, like it was part of the same system. The two creatures exchanged a glance, and I got the distinct impression they were communicating, even though neither of them made a sound. The taller one, the first creature, raised its hand and pointed to the glowing network of lights on the wall, the image of the galaxy I'd seen earlier. The smaller one nodded and turned to me, its expression softening slightly. It raised its hand, palm out, and I hesitated before mirroring the gesture. When our hands were about a foot apart, the glowing markings on its skin brightened, and I felt a faint warmth in the air between us. Then it spoke. The voice was soft, melodic, but the words weren't in any language I recognized. They flowed together like a song, rising and falling in a way that felt almost hypnotic. I had no idea what it was saying, but somehow I understood the intent behind it. It wasn't trying to scare me, it was explaining something. The images on the walls shifted again, cycling through a series of scenes faster than I could process. The earth, the web of lights, the ancient-looking map. It all blended together in a way that made my head spin. But one image stood out. A pod, identical to the one I'd found earlier, being lowered into the ground. The scene changed, showing a timeline of sorts, with more pods being buried in similar locations all over the planet. Some were marked with glowing lines that stretched outward, connecting them to the web of lights in the galaxy. Others weren't. I turned to the smaller figure, and it nodded, as if confirming my thoughts. These pods, these creatures, weren't just here randomly. They were part of something bigger, something that had been happening for a long time. The taller creature stepped forward and pointed to me, then to the glowing map on the wall. It made another series of tones, different from before, but still rhythmic and deliberate. The smaller one responded in kind, their voices blending together in a way that sounded almost like an argument. And then suddenly they both turned to me. The smaller one raised its hand again, this time pointing to the center of the platform. The lights beneath my feet brightened, and the pattern shifted, forming a circle around where I was standing. I felt a faint pull, not physical, but almost like gravity, like the room itself was urging me to stay still. The taller creature moved to one of the smaller machines surrounding the platform and placed its hand on it. The hum of machinery grew louder, and the image of the galaxy on the wall zoomed in, focusing on Earth. The lines connecting it to the other lights pulsed brightly, and for the first time I realized how few of them there actually were. Whatever this web was, it wasn't complete. The smaller creature took a step closer to me, its golden eyes meeting mine. For a moment I thought it might touch my shoulder or grab my hand, but it stopped just short of contact. It tilted its head slightly, and when it spoke again, the tone was different, softer, almost regretful. The images on the walls faded, replaced by a single line of text in the strange language. The creature gestured toward it, then back at me, as if asking me to make a choice. I didn't know what it wanted, but I could feel the weight of the decision pressing down on me. Stay and learn more, try to understand what this all meant, or leave, and let this remain a mystery I'd never fully comprehend. After what felt like hours but was probably only a few minutes, I stepped off the platform. The creatures didn't stop me. They watched as I walked back to the corridor. Their expressions, if you could call them that, still calm, still patient. I climbed back up the ladder, into the forest, and drove home without saying a word to anyone. It's been weeks since that day, and I still don't know what to make of it. The coordinates, the creatures, the strange symbols. They don't feel real anymore, like they were part of some fever dream I can't fully remember. but every now and then, when I'm lying in bed or scrolling through my phone, I think about that web of lights, about how incomplete it looked, and about how for just a moment I felt like I was part of it.